we moved here from Washington 9 years ago. And the first thing I did, I read in the paper a piece by David Steinberg saying that SouthWest Writers was having a speaker on the following Saturday. And I immediately came and joined, and it's been like a second home for me. I have so many friends who have been members of this organization. And for a couple of years I served on the board, which I truly enjoyed. But the very first memoir conference, in fact, the very first conference I attended here in Albuquerque was a memoir conference. And at that memoir, a speaker from Santa Fe held up this book, The Glass Castle by Jeanette Wall. And she said, this is the finest non-celebrity commercial memoir that has been written since Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes. So I went to the back of the room and purchased the book that day. And after I finished reading it, I was inspired to write my own memoir for the first time. And we had, coming up in a couple of years, every year during those times we had a contest with lots of different genres represented. So I sat down and wrote what I thought would be the first chapter of my memoir. And it was so painful. I literally wrote it with tears running down my face, because remembering the events that I depicted dramatically was that painful. It was like living them again. And that's what happens when you write memoir. You live certain events all over again. It was so painful, but I finally made a deal with myself. I wasn't going to finish it unless I won the contest. So I won the contest. And I always keep my appointments with myself. I always schedule my novels to be finished at a certain time and so on and so forth. Very disciplined in that way. So I wrote the entire memoir. It took me about 9 to 12 months. And when I finished it, the big issue was, do I really want to publish this? Well, here we are 9 years later, and I have not subjected it to publication. And I will tell you as we go on why that happened. First of all, let me see a show of hands. How many of you are thinking just in terms of writing a memoir for family and friends? Anybody? Okay, so your primary focus is something for your family and friends. So I assume then the rest of you are really interested in a commercially published memoir. Well, for those of you who are thinking only of family and friends, I have a few do's and don'ts before I go on to commercial memoirs. Do use photographs. The most charming memoirs I have seen for family and friends, and I will even include that great literary novelist Edna O'Brien from Ireland, includes pictures in their memoirs. Now, normally you do not see a black and white picture in a piece of fiction, but in memoirs you can use pictures, and it really increases your reader's ability to understand and to visualize what you were like, what your home was like, what your children were like during previous years. So number one, do use photos. Number two, do self-publish. I don't know much about the details of self-publishing, but for a memoir for family and friends, there's a whole variety of ways you can get it published. You can go to Kinko's, that's the cheapest way, and you can have 50 copies made. Or you can do what a friend of mine did here in Albuquerque. He paid, I think, $1,500 and had 1,000 copies printed. His memoir was this thick. And lo and behold, even though he had only written it for family and friends, it was called The Boy Who Loved Planes. And when the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum got wind of it, they purchased another 1,000 copies. And it's currently for sale in Washington at that museum. Third, do be truthful in your memoir for family and friends, and for that matter, in a commercial memoir. It's important to understand that you can recreate a scene using, you can't create the exact dialogue perhaps, although if you can remember it, that's great. But try and recreate what happened during that scene, the emotions that took place during that scene, who was in that scene. And write it using a novelist's skill set. There is no difference between the skill set you need to write a novel and the skill set you need to write a memoir. If you want your novel to be commercially published, use the same techniques and the skills that you do with fiction. I'd like to read a quote from Richard Russo, writing in the New York Times, November 1st, 2012, on writing memoir. I think the best memoirs read like novels, which means, among other things, that the writer must decide what fits the narrative arc and what doesn't. The fact that something actually happened doesn't mean it should be included. A memoirist isn't free to invent, but the shape of the story is up to him. He decides, as in a novel, how and where the story begins. Near the end, in his case, he also chooses, just as a novelist does, when to summarize and when time should slow down for a dramatic scene. Those are some of the most important things you need to remember. You need both in a memoir. You need dramatic scenes. Sometimes I call them vignettes. But you need small scenes and you need large scenes. And you connect the scenes with narrative, which frequently is a summarization of the things that took place between the two scenes.
For me, this entire process is about connection and how we make that connection in the writing, from the beginning in the writing, and with ourselves, to bring ourselves, to put ourselves on the page, and how we make that connection all the way through to our reader, to the marketing, to the publishing, through the entire process. I would like to begin by reading you the book synopsis of my memoir. Out of the counterculture movement of the 60s arises a true story about risking it all for true freedom. Folk singer Jerry Galloway and ex-ballet dancer Reva Lynn leave behind a life of opportunity and fame to raise a family in the woods of northern New Mexico. For 6 children born in the wild with no birth certificates, no worldly identity, only the song of nature printed on them at birth, the woods became a place of learning and a place of refuge, until tragedy uprooted their foundation, leaving the youngsters split between 2 worlds. When forced to choose for themselves, would they live in nature with their parents or seek a new life in society? Chloe Rachel Galloway is the soulful child, bringing us the healing power of the wild through her photographic memories, authentic voice, and a tale of modern-day warriors and free thinkers, carrying in their hearts an essential message about the priceless gifts of Mother Nature, her cycles of life and loss, and the transformative power of forgiveness. Today I want to talk to you guys about 2 very important things I believe in writing memoir, and that's cultivating emotional awareness. And this really deals with what Sandra was talking about, emotionally connecting to the reader. So when we write memoir, we need to make it emotionally compelling, right? The question is, how do we do that? And I'm going to go through parts of my story and give examples and lead you guys on a journey today of understanding how your mindset impacts your writing process. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is my daughter, Sophia. She's 7 years old. And so when I think about mindset, I really think about her, because she came to me one day. She goes to Montessori school. She came to me one day and she said, "Mommy, I've written my 8th book." And then I thought, well, everybody in the class must be writing books, right? And I went and I found out no one else is writing books. And Montessori school, they let them follow their own path and decide what they want to do. Not working. Yeah, that's weird. There we go. Mm-hmm. Does it not work, Sam, if I move around with it? Okay. So, yeah, so I've written 8 books, Mommy, and then she's just doing this on her own, and also she's connected to her mother's process. What I do is I help writers connect to their soul message and turn it into a powerful book. So I wasn't specifically talking to her about this, but I'm just role modeling it, right? Now, she walked into her first grade class this year and said to the teacher, I want you to know I'm an artist. Now think back into your memory, somewhere in your childhood, somewhere in us, we have this knowing, right, of what we are. And then the world sort of builds and builds, and a lot of emotional impact and traumas and different things happen to us. And we lose sight of that. And being just very clearly, I'm a writer. That's what I am. And showing up in the world in that way. Okay, next slide, Kimmy. Okay. So when it comes to your mindset, what is your mindset around your writing? Does it evoke something like this picture? Is it magical? Is it a spiritual, magical experience where writing just flows from you and it all happens miraculously? Or, next slide, Kimmy. Or is it possibly like this? Have you ever felt like this in the process of writing? Or next slide, Kimmy. Or like this. I say this happens when you get on the computer. Sometimes if you write with just pen and paper, it can help.
I shared the first 60 pages of what I'd written with my goddaughter, who is an author in her own right. And she said, surely other people will be interested in reading this. And I thought, really? Well, but she said, you need to write about your first husband, Joe. And so I did. And then when I got through that, I said, well, I might as well write about my philandering Greek lover. So I wrote about him. And my troubled mother, I wrote about her. So after 3 years, I had a manuscript that was substantial. And yet I felt something was missing. So over tea at Collected Works bookstore in Santa Fe, I met an editor, Morgan Farley, and I presented her with this manuscript with my concerns. 2 weeks later, she called and she said, I know exactly what's missing. So, eureka, we did meet again. For starters, she said, you have 4 books in one. So that was my first lesson. And a memoir is not a beginning to end autobiography. It's a slice of life, a limited time in scope, with a unifying theme. So my scope then became just 2.5 years. And my theme was finding love late, losing it too soon, and choosing to love again. So, with the scope narrowed and the theme clear, I still had a lot missing. I hadn't read many novels. I was a history major in college, where I developed a healthy regard for original sources. And I had them. I mean, my original sources was sort of a bushel of emails and a detailed journal. And these really proved invaluable in my first draft. But then I learned, this is lesson number 2, that a memoir is not just the visible external story. It's the inside story as well. In my 2.5-year period, I had a lot of action, but action alone was not sufficient. Explicit in the definition of memoir is intimate experience. Intimate meaning deep within. And I had to go deep inside, reliving some painful moments. I had to do this to find the truth, the unvarnished truth. And once I acknowledged it, I had to have the courage to put it on paper and let the chips fall where they may. This was hard for me initially because I'm not by nature particularly introspective, but when given the questions that my editor asked and the guidance, I found that I could be. And they were simple questions. I mean, she would write on my copy, so how did you feel? Well, what were you feeling? Well, I had a lot more to learn. I needed to learn, as has been mentioned here, the tools of fiction writing to make my memoir come alive, creating scenes, characters, and dialogue, resolving tension, the storyline, showing, not telling. As a longtime business writer, a scene when I would write was where a meeting took place. And dialogue, well, contrasting viewpoints on a single issue did not exactly make for conversation. We create scenes to anchor the reader with where we are and what's happening, with enough detail to give a sense of place, but not too much detail, because too much can inhibit the imagination of the reader. So as we're reading, we really want to visualize. We're using the writer's details to create a scene, a picture, but our imaginations go beyond that. So a scene takes place. I'm just in one place. There's in one place at one particular time, and then if you move that location or time in a significant way, then that's a new scene. I just wanted to say a bit about dialogue because we use it to reveal personality, character, and what's happening. And it also can move the story along. It's showing, not telling. So, in the scene, we want the reader to see and hear and sometimes smell everything that we see, hear, and smell. We want to give the reader a sense of being there in the moment, and then we embed the scene in the ongoing narrative. And I'm just going to read a brief scene with the idea of proving what I just said. Tall candles on the glass-topped dining table were flickering, the air fragrant with the aroma of Indian spices flavoring yogurt and chicken. We were having dinner at home. I have an idea. John lifted his wine glass, fixing me with his gaze. Let's go to Brittany in the spring. I'd love to. I lifted my glass to meet his, my heart thumping in delight. We could end up in Paris. Yes, I'll show you Brittany, and we can celebrate our first anniversary in Paris.
So what's it like to be a writer full-time? Well, it can be a joyous life, filled with self-discovery and fulfillment and sweatpants. But it can also be a lonely life, assaulted by crushing disappointments and setbacks of all kinds, mostly in the business end of it. The publishing industry is a lunatic asylum in a maze, aboard a sinking ship. Sorry about that many metaphors, but there it is. Thanks to self-publishing, it's never been easier to be published. It's never been harder to make a living as a writer than it is now. Nobody wants to pay for our words anymore. They think they come free on the internet. So why do we all want to be writers? Why do we torture ourselves this way? Almost anything is easier than writing. Part of it's the myth, though. Part of it's the myth of the writing life. This idea that you could be a full-time writer. Thanks to people like Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and J.D. Salinger, Americans have romantic notions about what it's like to be a writer. We picture a life of the mind, full of salons and deep conversations late at night with a lot of wine. Or we think of like Hemingway's kind of life, life filled with freedom to do the things that you wouldn't get to do otherwise, like go to bullfights or hunt big game or whatever. And this is increasingly the problem with the new writers. We picture fame and fortune. Becoming a rich celebrity who's such a celebrity we're really too busy to write at that point. Maybe best of all, we picture it as being like a hermit, some of us do anyway, like Salinger, just hidden from the world, picking away, perfectly happy, not giving speeches on Saturdays in Albuquerque. The writing life, of course, isn't exactly like any of those things. Little bits of all of those things, but not really like any. Fame and fortune are hard to come by, especially fortune. Any time spent on bullfights or big game hunting, it's probably time you should be promoting your book on Kindle. There is a sort of minor celebrity that comes with being an author, but most people will never hear of you. And that's a hard thing to choke down when you're, elbow deep in a manuscript that won't cooperate. But it's true. Most people never. I've been doing this 30 years, 30 books. I can walk down the street, nobody recognizes me. It's fine with me. There aren't any groupies. 30 years, not a single groupie. If you're seeking fame and fortune and groupies, you should learn to play the guitar, not the typewriter. Writing life does have its advantages. All the things you hate about your day job, poof, gone. Dress codes, meetings, schedules, customers, your cubicle, your boss, all gone. You don't have any of those things. And your paycheck. Yes, right. And your paycheck. And your benefits. And your, yes. Well played. There are times when you have to go out in the world like this. You have to put on long pants, autograph your latest book or whatever. But mostly you're at home talking to yourself every day. Some of the benefits. When you work at home, every day is Casual Friday. I haven't worn a necktie since I left the Albuquerque Journal 20 years ago. Most days I dress like a castaway. Sandals, cargo shorts, old t-shirt, volleyball with a face drawn on it for company. If it's cold weather, I'll add sweatpants to the mix because everyone looks good in sweatpants, always, ever. I don't wear them to the supermarket, I'll give you that. Because my mother, who's not dead yet, would roll over in her grave. When you're a writer, you can tend to things at home while you're working. You can do the laundry, other chores like that. Some of my best ideas have come while vacuuming. Because you can't play music or be distracted, just pretty soon you're thinking about your book. And that same spot's been vacuumed 35 times.
In 1968, my wife and I returned from Spain. But when we arrived in Spain in 1965, because I was a doctoral student at the University of Granada, we arrived there during Holy Week. And the amazing thing, and this goes to show you how one can learn whether you're 21 or 81. It doesn't matter. You always learn something. And I learned very quickly the similarities between the religious practices in southern Spain and my little village. See, my grandmother wearing her black mantilla, and seeing the little old ladies. At that time, to me, they were old. And now I is their age, okay? So it was kind of a catharsis. But more importantly, I think that's when I began to see that my childhood indeed was important and could be important to other people such as yourselves who are here to listen to what I have to say. Trustfully, it'll be of some help. In 1968, I came after 3 years, I decided to interview my paternal grandparents who had spent the majority of their lives in the Rio Puerco. My grandfather died when he was 100, and my grandmother died when she was 89 or 93, thereabouts. They were getting ready to celebrate their 75th wedding anniversary. So there was a lot of information that I was able, not from them necessarily, because I was a novice in interviewing people. I didn't know anything about oral history, but that's really the genesis of where my interest began as far as putting together a memoir. In the meantime, there was a hiatus of sorts because I spent the next 30-some years interviewing people. And most of my books, the initial books, are on oral history. Okay, so an epiphany, inspiration to put together a memoir. How did that happen? I started reflecting on my childhood, and I remember a pivotal period as a child. I was 5 years old. My father was working for the CC camps at WPA. He would come home on Fridays, and he always brought me a little brown sack of hard candy, and I would eat that whole thing for dessert. Well, needless to say, by the time I was 6 years old, I had cavities like you wouldn't believe. And there were no dentists around. But one Friday, my father came home. He didn't have a bag of candy. And he told me, but I have something very special. He had bought me a little tin pistol. And for some reason, he thought that was going to appease me. Well, when my mom handed me the pistol, I was at this end of the table, my dad was over here. I got that sucker and threw it at my dad. And he ducked, and I broke the window to the kitchen. For the first time, I began to appreciate the landscape, because you'll see at the end of my presentation, Cabezon Peak was an iconic volcanic plug. I saw that for the first time, and I reflected instantaneously, and I said, isn't that beautiful? So that was the beginning of an interest for me to begin to put together a memoir. Memoir writing is obviously the resurrection of your past. It's a self-portrayal evolving the process of inclusion and delusion. One thing I did not do, because I had learned in doing some research about how to conduct oral history, there was so much information, it was confusing. So when I started putting together my memoir, I decided I'm not going to go and research as to how you write a memoir. I'm just going to do it, okay? Because I thought, and I think in retrospect, I was right. You can only become more and more confused when you start researching how to put together a memoir. Okay, that's why I say it's a process of inclusion, and the pitfall is delusion, because you can. There are times when you'll be tempted to add something that's not quite real. It's not part of your persona. It's not part of what went on in your life as a child. So that was one of the things I learned. Why is your story and mine important? I think this is something that that's worth keeping in mind, okay? Because you may think that there is something fundamentally important in your life, your childhood, whatever period you decide to write about, and other people would say, boy, that sucks. So you have to be careful, or at least conscious of that. Getting started, setting what I call the stage. And if you look at the outline, you can follow. I'd like to think that every beginning has an open ending. Why? Because there is no memoir, at least in my experience, that has a final ending. There was always something that's going to be left out, either purposely or inadvertently. And in retrospect, that has happened to me. I now realize that there were some things that I could have included. On the other hand, I was also conscious that publishers, you and I published my memoir, publishers don't like to have manuscripts that are beyond 400, 500 pages. So my manuscript was 445, and by the time it was published, it's 330 some pages. So that's something to keep in mind.
Thinking about your audience, about an active reader, is a way to help you see the significance of your story. And I mean from the very beginning of writing it. A lot of times people think they'll worry about their audience later, but you want to have your audience sort of back here the whole time. When we imagine how our story will be received by someone else, how it will impact someone else, it helps us make key decisions in the process of writing and keeps in front of us, like the ultimate carrot, that this story will matter to other people too. And you all know that you do have to believe that. You have to believe your story will matter in order to write it. A story is a transaction between writer and reader. We'll be looking today at what I call the contract with the reader. Many writers write for a select audience, maybe a group of people they think will really relate to what they're writing. So, for example, a memoir about breast cancer may be written with cancer survivors in mind, detailing the challenges of battling the disease and emerging, battered maybe, but wiser and still going forward. Other writers tell a specific story about the death of a spouse, the difficulties of relationship with family or with a sibling, often with the mother or father, the victorious climb out of poverty into a life of education and purpose, and assume that the story's compelling properties will attract the readers it ought to have. However the writer considers the concept of audience is essential. The direct perceiver of the experience the memoir details. Your audience receives your story, interprets it, digests it. I like to think in terms of food metaphors with your audience, because in a way, when you read a book, it is like you're eating it. You know, you're chewing on it, you're digesting it. Through the interaction of writer, story, reader, your story becomes part of the other person's experience. A greater awareness of audience makes the decisions of the writer easier. If, for example, we think about each chapter as a microcosm of the whole book that has its own story arc, crisis followed by rising action, followed by a climactic moment, then structuring the book becomes more manageable. Instead of 250 or 300 pages stretching out into the distance, we can think of 10 or 12 or 15 chapters of episodes or scenes that unspool our story in a way that sweep the reader along. Sometimes when we read, we imagine the writer whispering in our ear. The experience is that intimate. The ability to create intimacy and community at the same time helps explain the popularity and the significance of memoirs like Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, or Jeanette Wall's The Glass Castle, two that you may have read. Worth reading if you haven't. If that's the case, the writer has found a way to capture his or her audience and not let them go until the story is through with them. The early 20th century American writer Gertrude Stein, who I studied for a long time, once said, I write for myself and for strangers. It's absolutely true that first and foremost, we do write for ourselves. We are the watchers and listeners of all of our stories. We hear the story first in our own heads. And yet we yearn for our stories to go beyond us, to reach others, to affect the life of those strangers Stein is talking about. Today I'd like to first explore what our obligations are to our audience. How do we approach the idea of the reader out there in the world? How can we court the reader, reach the reader, and be inspired by our readers? The importance of audience is something I think we all know innately. Writers are people who like to share. We communicate our stories to those who will listen. We want to connect with others, to entertain, to educate, and sometimes to persuade others. We want to make an impact. Those who want to write for themselves are doing something important and valuable. But I'm speaking even more today to those who want to reach outside themselves and share their stories with their readers, who want to fill the empty page with living, breathing characters and a gripping situation. The page and the stage share this need for an audience, a reader or listener to complete the loop that exists among author, text, and appreciator. Imagine an audience in a theater if they could not see or hear, if the play doesn't reach beyond the footlights. Actors talk about needing the feedback of the audience, that it makes the moment on stage real, something visceral and exciting. I recently had the opportunity to see A Doll's House Part 2 in New York, which just won a Tony for its major actress. It's a retelling of Ibsen's A Doll's House. And it was really stunning to see this play about gender and have the whole audience like not breathing. They were so involved in the story. It was like the story was being told to each one of them. And that's kind of what you aim for. It was very exciting. There's a reason that the first storytelling was oral. Traditions were passed on this way, with a living body speaking to another living body. The audience not only interpreted the story, but shaped the story with its perceptions and its own experiences. Leslie Marmon Silko once said, and I paraphrase, that the best storytellers create an atmosphere where the listeners feel they are part of the story. And I think that's really true, that when you hear a great story, you feel like, oh, I've been there, I'm part of this. So it's almost like weaving the audience into the fabric of the story. Today we're talking about written stories. How can they have the same kind of immediacy to their audience as oral ones? We'll start with what our obligations are as writers to our audience in writing memoir. That will lead us to the expectations of your audience, and finally, ways to honor the reader and honor your story. First, our readers expect that the story in a memoir will be about a very specific and subjective vision of the writer. It's the story of a particular journey that the writer has taken. No one else could possibly tell this story, and that's something to remind yourself of over and over again, that nobody has heard your story. They may have heard another story about mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, whatever it's about, but they have not heard your story. No one else but you can tell this story. And that's really important.